Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to what promises to be a most informative, thought-provoking, and inspirational session that we have for you now as we explore topics related to the U.S.-China dynamic. Today we have a distinguished group of panelists who are joining us, and I have the great privilege of introducing our moderator for this most important discussion. Cunzeman is the Director of Strategic Foresight at Aerospace Corporation. Kara has been involved in the space sector for a number of years and has had responsibility for championing and founding the Strategic Foresight Directorate at Aerospace and serving as its very first director. In her role, Cunzeman leads an interdisciplinary team focused on applied strategic foresight, helping the enterprise adequately prepare its organizations and capabilities to proactively shape the future through innovative approaches across strategy, acquisition, science, and the technology portfolio management, policy, and operations. So I can't think of a better person to help navigate us through this conversation. Kara, welcome.
All right, let's get comfy. This is going to be a tough discussion here. I think before we dig in, I just have to say the youth perspectives at this venue have been absolutely inspiring. So we may go down a deep rabbit hole in this conversation, but I am absolutely just floored by the enthusiasm and innovation from our young population. So thank you for featuring that. You don't normally see that, and I think it's really unique in this venue. Okay, so as many of you know, we're on the cusp of having China and others start to make their way towards advancing in space capabilities like we've never seen before. And for the first time since the Cold War, the US is facing pretty intense competition, both kind of tangible, but also thinking about how that might impact prestige, soft power, economics, social well-being. And the question is how important is this changing environment for the United States? And is there more that we should be considering? So we have some pretty amazing people on stage with us here to dive into those topics. And I'm going to welcome our amazing panelists one by one. I'll introduce them, and then we're just going to dive right in. We have a good amount of time, but this is a meaty topic. So on my left, I have Dean Cheng. He is the Senior Advisor for the China Program at the United States Institute for Peace. Next to him, we have Dr. Kevin Pollpeter, Senior Research Scientist at the Center for Naval Analysis. Next is Kristin Burke, Senior Space and Counterspace Researcher at the China Aerospace Studies Institute. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Scott Pace, Space Policy Institute Director at GWU. We're really excited to have you all here. So before we get into some of those really meaty questions that we want to explore, I thought it'd be good, because each of these are experts in their own right, to just kind of level set us. Like, where are we in this moment of time? What are things that we kind of should be considering as we try to work through some of these kind of changing issues? So we're just going to go down the line and spend a few minutes hearing from each of our panelists. Dean, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. So when we were talking about what each of us would be addressing with China and Mars, which very much is like the four blind men and the elephant, I said that I'd be happy to take on sort of the trunk, which is to say, how does China look at space in general, of which Mars is a piece? And I think to level set first, it's very important to recognize how different China is from the other space powers. We often say, we're back in a space race, but that casts the Chinese as another Soviet Union. And the fundamental realities are that, one, China is frankly richer than the Soviet Union, but two, that where space in the space race was really about just politics in the 1950s and 60s, leading eventually over to things like nuclear ICBMs and things. With the Chinese, their history in their space efforts is different. That, for example, a previous head of the Space Policy Institute, John Logsdon, once said that the American space program began on December 8th, 1941. If only we had seen the Japanese coming, we might have, prevented Pearl Harbor. If that's true, the Soviets probably started their space program, mentally at least, on June 23rd, 1941. If only we had seen Hitler massing. China doesn't have that history of surprise attack, doesn't have that if only we had prevented a bolt out of blue. So their space program has been driven much more by a broader set of considerations, what they term comprehensive national power, which touches on military capability, economic strength, diplomatic respect, political unity, level of science technology, even cultural security, something which most Americans don't think about. And space touches every single piece of that. A great space program is going to yield military benefits, economic benefits, promote science and technology, is going to make people proud to be Chinese and make China appealing. And so a successful space program with successful marquee projects is a key part of the motivation underlying the willingness to frankly spend enormous amounts of money, and as important, enormous amounts of human potential in developing the space program. One of the other interesting things here is that Deng Xiaoping, one of the great leaders of China, said that great powers contribute to the pool of human knowledge. And I think one of the aspects that we need to keep in mind is that China pursues big science. Whether it is space or genomics or oceanography, in part to demonstrate that it actually is contributing to the global pool of science and knowledge. But let's be honest, China is also interested in the political impact of space. And one of the things here to consider, whether it is lunar or Mars or deep space in general, is space governance. And one of the things the Chinese have said that they want to influence in the coming years is the rules for space. To put it simply, what should be the language of space? If you ever watched Firefly, Serenity, it was always interesting how you had a mix of English and Chinese, both in the signage, but also even in the slang. And I think that accurately reflected the idea behind the Chinese motivation, that space is not going to be a Western preserve, an American preserve. But how do you prevent that? You prevent it not by going out there and dictating, although that helps, and the Chinese are good at trying to dictate things, but more importantly, by outnumbering, by launching more missions, by having a larger presence, by having weekly flights as opposed to annual flights. And I think one of the things that we need to be thinking about here, as the Chinese look into a human mission to the moon by 2030, a Mars sample retrieval mission potentially by next year, human spaceflight with Chinese crews to Mars, is the reality that almost certainly they are not going to be one and done. That they are not going to submit to the idea that, well, once we've planted a Chinese flag, whether on the moon or on Mars, with people or without, that we have achieved our mission. Not if the goal is to basically help determine how space is going to be governed, especially space traffic management. So in this regard, this conversation we are having today about humans to Mars is about sending humanity to Mars, but in Beijing it is also the idea of sending Chinese to Mars. Not simply to plant a flag, not simply to establish a presence, but in order to determine what the rules will be, what the language will be.
Thank you, Dean. And also pretty short for how many thoughts you have on this topic, so appreciate that. All right, over to you, Dr. Pollpeter.
Okay, thank you, Kara. Okay, so I was going to talk a little bit about what China has done, what it's doing, what it plans to do in terms of Mars exploration. So this will just be a wave top look since we really only have 5 minutes, so we can engage more, I guess, during the Q&A. But first, let me just start off that actually China has already conducted 2 Mars exploration missions. The first one occurred in 2011. It was a Mars orbiter called Inghol 1. Unfortunately, it did not make it to Mars. It was piggybacking on a Russian rocket that was the Phobos Grunt mission that was going to explore the Martian moon Phobos. That rocket had some problems and was unable to launch the craft into the proper orbit, and they eventually fell back to Earth. But China tried again in 2020, this time on their own, right? Not relying on anybody else, and that time it was a success. This mission was called Tianwen-1, okay, kind of a mouthful, but sort of loosely translated as astronomical questioning. Before this, no country had attempted to send an orbiter and a rover to Mars on the first try. China did it successfully, and I think this shows again, as Dean has been talking about, that China was out to prove that it could do something different, that it was more capable than other space powers, right? They're showing how they're a step above. The mission landed on Mars on May 14th, 2021, so about 3 years ago next week on Utopia Planitia, the vast Martian plane where the Viking 2 spacecraft landed in the 1970s. So this made China just the third country to soft land on Mars and just the second one to land a rover on Mars after the United States, of course. That rover is named Zhurong. It was designed with a service life of 90 sols. But was active for more than 347, so it vastly outlived its performance envelope. Zhurong went into hibernation about 2 years ago at this time, in May 2022, preparing for the Martian winter, and unfortunately it was not able to be woken up. They think that maybe dust from the Martian soil covered the solar panels, and so it's permanently out of action now. But Tianwen-1, that first Mars mission, has made some important accomplishments. The orbiter stayed up around Mars and mapped the entire red planet. The rover has found evidence that there was an ocean at one time on Utopia Planitia. So maybe some of this science is not necessarily new, but it's contributing to the larger body of knowledge that we have about Mars. So how does Tianwen-1 compare to, let's say, Perseverance? First of all, Tianwen-1 used a more conventional approach to land on Mars, right? It had the parachutes with the capsule that landed on, opened up. The rover went down a little ramp. You know, it wasn't like the more complex sky crane approach that Perseverance used. Perseverance is also much more technologically complex than Zhurong. Zhurong weighs 240 kilograms. Perseverance is in at over 1,000 kilograms, so a much larger, much more sophisticated vehicle. Perseverance relies on radioisotope thermoelectric generator for power, whereas we know Zhurong had the solar panels, and that ultimately led to its demise. Perseverance is still out there working, right? I looked at it today. It was 1,143 sols and still going, right? So good for it. Generally, Zhurong had a number of sensors on it, but not quite as complex as Perseverance, let's say. There were there's a ground-penetrating radar, a climate station, a surface compound detector, a camera, and some navigation aids. And of course, Perseverance, we know, had a lot of experiments to create oxygen out of the Mars atmosphere. Also had a ground-penetrating radar, a climate station, an array of other sensors, but just generally more sophisticated than Zhurong. And of course, one of the primary differences between the Perseverance mission and Zhurong is that we had Ingenuity, the small little mini-copter that went out there and flew around. So much more complex, much more science able to be collected. So where are we headed? So China plans by 2030, it wants to launch a mission to retrieve a 500-gram sample of Martian soil and return it to the Earth. This appears to be a less sophisticated mission than the one that NASA and ESA has planned. This one really is meant to touch down in that one particular spot, grab some Martian soil, and then head back. It's different from the envisioned mission where Perseverance has gone out there and collected the soil, will then go back, collect it, and bring it back to a craft to send back. So overall, what we see is really that China has taken a less technologically complex approach. On the other hand, they appear ready to do it, whereas, as you know, we have had our own problems. So this is sort of part and parcel of how China has approached other programs. Start out small, make it technologically, budgetarily feasible, and then build upon the success step by step. Maybe that's a lesson that NASA and ESA can learn from the Chinese. Secondly, there's a lot of talk about competition between China and the US in space. We don't necessarily need to view it as a competition. We don't necessarily need to view it as a sprint. It could be a marathon. China may be able to get to Mars and do a Mars retrieval mission first. Doesn't mean that we can't do it second and better. And I did mention we don't necessarily have to make it a competition. It could be cooperation. There could be some sort of scientific collaboration. Right now, there's lots of restrictions on NASA cooperating with China, but cooperation doesn't necessarily have to mean technology sharing. We can maybe share the results of our research. And fourth, Mars exploration is just one aspect of China's deep exploration plan. That also includes lunar exploration and the exploration of Jupiter. And so if you look at it right now, it looks like really the priority is on the moon, much less a priority is on Mars. Finally, I'd just like to point out that China has a lot planned for the 2030 timeframe. If all goes as planned, they will have landed a human on the moon. They will have retrieved a sample for Mars. They will have started exploring Jupiter, not to mention all the other successes they may achieve in regards to human spaceflight, in regards to national security, in regards to commercial uses of space. So most of this has been done by the US, but still, in just 6 short years, China could announce that it really has arrived in space, and we need to be prepared for the signal that will send to the rest of the world. So thank you.
Thank you. Excellent remarks, Kevin. All right, over to you, Kristin. I guess we have some slides too.
Yes, let's see if they will show. Okay, so we've gone to, there we go. Can everybody see that okay? Yeah. Okay, good. So I thought it would be worthwhile to provide an audience who I assume goes to IAC, UN, COPIUS, GLEX, with some framework for thinking about the people that are on the who are Chinese space experts who also go to those meetings, who you might have the opportunity to bump into in the elevator or something like that. So to give you a framework for thinking about the timeline that they might present at one of these international conferences specific to a Chinese crewed Mars mission. And so in the future, we can anticipate that there will be news or some sort of presentation about a crewed mission to Mars for the Chinese. And there's 2 types of information that you really need to have in order to kind of think through that. First is what I'm calling foundational knowledge. You should have some sense of what are national plans on the Chinese side, either a national plan or an administrative plan, like a Chinese Academy of Science, China National Space Administration, those kind of organizations. There will be some sort of plan that has already put some thinking into motion. Those are very readily available, but you do usually need to look for them in Chinese. The second kind of foundational knowledge you need to have is an authoritative statement of ambition. Usually we are waiting to see the China Manned Space Administration come out and say something, but what we've learned in the lunar program scenario is they might not be the only credible source that we can pay attention to. Once you have that kind of foundational knowledge, which is there a national plan for a crewed Mars mission, and are there credible people talking about it? When you hear something at an international conference, you need to hold yourself accountable for finding out a couple of pieces. You need to answer these questions. What's the background of the person who is presenting the information? Usually the conference will introduce the person, or the media will summarize the person as only having one hat. But Chinese people, as in many other countries, government officials have multiple hats. So it's worth looking into where else do they work, and specifically in the case of people that go to those conferences and speak, are they a current official or are they a retired official? The second question you should really try to answer is if they are presenting at a conference in English, you need to look to see if they have previously presented in the Chinese press on the same thing. With all that information, you can determine if the timeline that they are presenting to you is credible. So let's look at what are the lessons we can learn from now having an authoritative, credible timeline for a Chinese crewed lunar mission. First, there is a Chinese Academy of Science national plan as early as 2009 saying around 2030 we will send a crew to the moon. And so that timeline is pretty, they did a pretty good job of estimating their timeline given that they set that in motion in 2009. We've been looking at the China Manned Space Engineering Office as the primary credible source for information on when the crewed mission would happen, but we can see that they're more likely to be cautious in their statements about a mission, because it's actually their lives which are at stake if they speed up the technology that would take them to the moon. So they're more likely to be conservative in their estimation of time. In 2009, when the Chinese Academy of Science National Plan was published with the around 2030 timeframe, two experts had statements that were also pretty similar. They were saying around 2020 or as early as 2025. And in 2009, those two people were employed by the Chinese state-owned enterprises working on different types of systems related to the lunar program. The recent statements that they were saying were in the years where they were retired. And so the average person looking at this, trying to estimate the timeline, thought, okay, well, they're not an authoritative source because they're retired. So we're waiting for the authoritative government source to give us a timeline, and that's the China Manned Space Administration. And so a lesson learned there is if we look at the background of the people, these two people at the time when the national plan was made were employed, and Ye Peijian was an engineer working on the Chang'e 1, so he was specifically involved in the lunar program. And Long Lehao was not working on a rocket to go to the moon, but he was on the lunar exploration leading small group, which is a government organization that works on early planning for the missions. So now, if you're going to UN Copious, you're starting to see them present on a crewed Mars mission around the 2050 to 2040 timeframe. So let's run this through the checklist, right? So we need to think of what did the national plan say and who are these people? So the same Chinese Academy of Science national plan, which got it right in 2009 that around 2030 they would send a crew to the moon, also has a statement about a crewed Mars mission. It says around 2050. People who are authoritative sources of these statements, if we look at the manned, I call them CMSC, that's the Chinese translation, but for English-speaking audience, the China Manned Space Administration, they have been actually much more forward-leaning in saying earlier about their ambition to send a crew to Mars. So that's very significant. They're not being cautious in this case. We also have some of the same experts with saying things about Mars already, and we also have an additional person saying as early as 2033. And Ye Peijian said as early as 2035. And so when we're talking about who to watch in the future, these are the people I'm proposing that if you see them at a conference, do strike up a conversation with them, because they probably have a good idea of what's going on. In terms of the China Manned Space Engineering folks, you've seen the first two guys, and the second, Wang Yue, he was a participant in the Mars, was it Mars 500? They simulated a long-term human, looking at the psychological impacts of a crew that would be in a Mars exploration scenario very early on, and it was with the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese. The Americans didn't have any participants, but he is still involved in the Manned Space Engineering Training Organization, and so if he starts to talk about a crewed Mars mission, he probably knows what he's talking about. In the case of state-owned enterprises, Longle Hao is still involved in mentoring the two additional rocket engineers you see there. And of all the rockets in China, these are the two rocket engineers and the rockets which are rated for crew, right? And that's how to kind of distinguish all the people that work on rockets in China, who's more likely to know about a crewed mission to Mars. It's gonna be the people that are working on the crew-rated rockets. And lastly, it's the crewed landing system for the Moon program. They talk about how that system and the rocket, the Long March 10 that will take humans to the moon, will be the same systems that they use to get humans to Mars. And so that's why I include Yongle there as well. And so here's additional reading if you're interested in learning about the Chinese Academy of Science, or excuse me, the China Aerospace Studies Institute's reports. And we are going to do a more thorough report on thinking through the Chinese Mars, the crewed mission to Mars in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. All right, Dr. Pace.
Okay. Let's see. And where is mine? There we go. Okay. Personal anecdote to start with, keying off of something that Dean said. When I was a lab technician at JPL in the 70s, one of my bosses was a guy named Taylor Wang, who flew aboard Space Lab, and we were doing drop dynamics and zero-G experiments and so forth. So he was the god, he was the PI, I was a lowly technician. And one of the things that was interesting after Taylor flew was the China National Space Agency had updated their website and proudly noted that Taylor was the first Chinese in space. Even though he was Chinese American, yes, he was born in Shanghai, but he was the first Chinese in space. Second thing where I don't know if this is a difference for you, Dean. Yes, the Chinese are very much interested in soft power. I have yet to see them, maybe I missed it, them have a press conference from their space station in anything other than Chinese. So it's primarily talking to a Chinese audience. They don't have anybody playing guitar in English or anything like that. And thirdly, something also you made me think about, the importance of presence. If we look at Antarctica, and people are justifiably proud of the Antarctic Treaty System and peaceful scientific exploration. It's been that way for years and years and years. But it's showing some interesting signs of stress, in part because of the increasing numbers on the ice. And we're seeing, I think, a 5th Chinese station down there. We might have maybe 1,000, 1,200 people on the ice during certain times. And things are okay, but you can also see how issues of standards, of communication protocols, so forth, would wind up being, shaped simply, by dint of presence. So with that, let me talk a little bit about shaping the environment. One of the things, of course, China talks about, I'm sure you're all familiar with, the International Lunar Research Station, which is their idea, and a lot of it, should look fairly familiar. They're out getting other people to also sign up and be part of this. It's not quite clear what other countries are going to actually be doing in this, and somewhat in a counter to the image of two sort of mutually exclusive camps. There is a number of countries that are members of both the Artemis Accords and members of ILRS. So people like the UAE come to mind. That are in there. And of course, we've said, officially, that if China wanted to sign the Artemis Accords tomorrow, happy to have them. There's nothing really in there that I think they should have trouble signing on to. But nonetheless, they haven't for whatever reason. The other is that if they were to come up with their own idea of Artemis Accords, ILRS, if it had, I think, any sort of relationship to international law,
that we recognize, I could easily imagine a mutual recognition arrangement. You know, they recognize Artemis Accords, we recognize LRS, what do we do? Then let's maybe, you know, talk about operations rather than just theory. Now, a thing which is becoming much more real and near-term immediate now is things like space communications and navigation around the moon. We have our own ideas called LunaNet, which I should stress is not a NASA system. It's actually a system of a number of like-minded countries, ourselves, Japan, Europe, European Space Agency, other partners. It's sort of an international structure to it. China has its own ideas on this. And what was notable in the most recent World Radio Communications Conference, Work 23, was approval of an agenda item that will be part of the work program for the next several years until Work 27 about allocation of frequencies for exclusive use in comm-nav purposes in the space-to-space direction, which will be in space. And the Chinese concept and the US concepts do not obviously clash. Of course, they're distinct and different. But if we're going to get these frequency allocations approved through the ITU, then making sure the other major player out there is on board is maybe a hopeful sign to begin with. Sorry for the eye chart, but the main point sort of we want to make here is a lot of people talk about lunar resources and potential conflict with China on lunar resources. That is absolutely potentially possible. On the other hand, if you get into the working groups within space resources in the UN, you find that we're really not that far apart from them on a lot of things. What holds us in common is we don't want to be told what to do by some transnational UN organization that's not accountable, and the Chinese have the same view. So we both kind of nod at each other regarding that. You want to go use resources? Yeah, so do I. Okay, great. And then that still doesn't preclude other areas of conflict, but I think those are areas where we should be discussing technically what do we actually want to do, communicating that state to state level. It's not really a philosophical kind of disagreement. The other eye chart up there, it talks about lunar sample exchange. Now, given the political structure between ourselves and the Chinese, we're not going to be doing manned spaceflight together anytime soon. But that doesn't mean, as in the Cold War, there can't be other levels of cooperation, exchanging lunar samples, exchanging biomedical data, information on space situational awareness. By the way, we have an arrangement for exchanging SSA data around Mars. We don't have one around the moon. So finding ways to do that. The picture there is of the template you're supposed to sign and fill out and agree to if you want to have some Chinese lunar samples. Most of it is fine, but there are areas, though, where it does distinctly differ from US practices. There tends to be a central node to go through. There's some rights of pre-approval to go through. You have to sign up potentially for criminal liability if something goes wrong. So there's a number of things which are not quite the way you would do it if you're a scientist getting something, say, from the Lunar Receiving Lab, in Houston. So whatever their standards and norms are going to be for science exchange, I think is still a subject for discussion. Now, in part of that discussion, one of the things that is a notable problem is even where to talk. There are things like the International Space Exploration Forum, which has all the major space agencies, but that doesn't represent the state level governmental. It represents the agencies level. There's lots of NGOs, there's lots of track twos, there's lots of things, side conversations at nice conferences, but those, again, are not state-to-state kind of discussion. It was mentioned the Chinese presentations at UN Copious. Those are great. You can go to their website and download technical presentations and find copies of, so I commend that site to you. Because we have a hard time doing direct bilateral talks with China, one of the things we can do is have multilateral talks, as we do in the ITU. Romania, believe it or not, has proposed a consultative mechanism on lunar activities, which would be not normative in any way, but would be basically a communication mechanism, multilateral, state level, to talk about issues of common interest. And this is similar, in my view, others may not share this view, but We have an international committee in the UN on GNSS for all the navigation satellite system providers, including China and Russia, Japan, India, ourselves, Galileo in Europe, exchange information about our respective systems. And that just straight information exchange, I think, has been helpful in heading off, a number of issues. So before we start getting into writing treaties and rules and what people should do, we first need to have a basis of knowledge about what each other is doing, and an official basis of knowledge, not merely what people might read in the press one way or the other. So working on that. So net, positive, negatives, uncertainties in working with China. There's a couple things which are positive. The consultative mechanism, as I said, has been relatively positively received. I've heard and have recordings of China on the mic saying that they are open to these kinds of talks. I've had the Russians say that they think this is an important proposal and giving it serious consideration. So we're going through all those sort of UN dance sort of things. The ITU, I think, has been generally working out well. The problem there is not lunar or Mars comm-nav issues, really it's the mega constellations. And we've had several blow-ups, both in the ITU and in COPUS, mostly coming from Iran, regarding mega constellations. The Working Group on Space Resources, I think largely we're in the same place. Neither, I think, ourselves or China want to go toward a more formalized structure the way I think some of our European colleagues want to go. I already mentioned Artemis Accords and ILRS. And we have a number of other venues where these issues are played out. Probably one of the ones that's going to be fairly near term is discussing what safety zones there might be on the moon. Because when you come landing down, the rocket plume kicks up a lot of dust, sends rocks all over the place. If you haven't prepared a landing site beforehand, some people talk about building big berms with presumably tractors that have been deposited there beforehand to shield that. But safety zones, which are talked about in Artemis, should not be arbitrary. They should actually be based on some technical content. So you don't want to have somebody land and say, I just claimed this area, the size of my home province. It wants to be related to, in fact, safety of operations. But that's, again, something that needs to be discussed. And as many of you sort of know, when I talk about space cooperation, I'm usually intent on saying that space cooperation follows geopolitics. It doesn't lead geopolitics. That space cooperation is absolutely a lagging indicator about where things are. And so the driving issues are not really going to be space, especially civil space in particular, which I think is actually a mildly hopeful area. But it's going to be all the other issues. So it's going to be the South China Sea, India, Tibet, Taiwan, of course, Hong Kong, other players, Iran and Russia, which way they're going to be going, the growth of counterspace weapon systems, which make life particularly sporting, IP theft, cyberspace, all those other irritants, in the relationship are going to be, which is why I say we can be hopeful about maybe some small or scientific bilateral exchanges, which in the words of past summit statements have been reciprocal, transparent, and mutually beneficial. Those sort of code words, I think there is a number of things that we can do as we watch the Chinese program develop. With that, we end.
All right, wow. That was like a crash course, right, in all things China space. So we talked about kind of recent advancements and kind of near-term programs and plans, and then all the way out to the moon and Mars. Some of you touched on this, but I think it would be healthy, before we jump into some of the harder questions, just to maybe articulate, and we don't also have to agree on everything. I know there's a lot of head nodding, but it's okay if we don't all agree. Just on your personal impressions of China's space ambitions, like why are all of these developments so important to them in their broader doctrine? Dr. Pace, you just kind of talked about it's a lagging indicator of other things they have going on. Like where does space fit in their overall national narrative? Anybody want to give this a shot? Dean?
Sure.
Yeah.
So China is run by the Chinese Communist Party, as the name implies, they're communist, which goes to the Marxist-Leninist aspect. So why is this guy talking about all this stuff? Because as good Marxist-Leninists, they see the world through the idea of what is the form of economic power, what is the form of economic generation, and it has evolved over time. And as that evolves, society and all societal activities, war, economies, social progress, changes. From the Chinese perspective, we have gone from the information age, when what mattered was stuff. How many tons of bauxite did you smelt last year? How many I-beams did you produce last year? Not to say that's not still important, but now we live in the information age. Who generates information? Who moves information? Who analyzes and exploits information? That is the currency of power: economic power, military power, societal power. Space is absolutely vital for the generation of information, reconnaissance satellites, the movement of information, telecommunication satellites, weather satellites, and then finally the exploitation. All those cool images of tomahawks and other things going through the second window, not the third window, on the left, is powered by GPS. So broadly speaking, if you want to be a major power, you have to be an information power. And space is a key, not the only, but a key avenue, alongside chips and computers and information technology writ large, of becoming an information power.
Other perspectives?
Dean has talked about politics, a little bit about the military. I'll talk historical. China's national narrative, if you will, how it sees itself and how it sees others, is largely derived from a 100-year period from 1839 to 1949 that they call the Century of Humiliation. And during that time, smaller powers, let's say Great Britain, France, Japan, not only beat China but really trounced them. It caused a lot of self-doubt within China. What evolved out of this over many decades was a sense that technology is extremely important to national survival. And in fact, the communists now call science and technology the first productive force, because it is the basis for how you develop a great nation. It's the underlying basis for your economy, for your military, of course, for your science and technology power, and then also just for your soft power. And so when they hone in on what kind of technologies they want, space plays, I would say, an outsized role in that for all of the reasons that Dean outlined. That they say that space technology is the highest of the high technologies, that you can't be a great power without space technology, and this is an area that China not only needs to play in, but they need to excel. And so what they are saying now is that by 2035, they need to be sort of a respectable space power, but by mid-century, think 2045 to 2050, they need to be a world-class space power, which means that they are on par with the United States in most technologies, and in some technologies, they are actually leading the United States.
And in order to fit those 2050 timeframes, if you know about the Chinese population in terms of the demographic issues, they have a steep declining working age population. And so space also plays this role in, you have a Chinese Communist Party, you have a controlled economy, and you need them to be innovative. That's a tall order. So how are you going to control the innovation and spur it at the same time? Sectors like space do both for you. It's a national security strategic program, and so it's kind of weds itself to control, but at the same time it gives the very small working aged group of people inspiration and drive to be innovative, and so it helps them achieve, as my two colleagues have said, these information goals and these future goals for 2050.
Yeah, in many ways, the Chinese motivations are not dissimilar at all. I mean, there are things, as Dean says, the Chinese Communist Party is central. I mean, don't confuse the party with the state or with the people, frankly. They're distinct. But promoting space produces pride and therefore tolerance for the Communist Party, in terms of delivering economic benefits or other benefits that people take pride in. It's a way of attracting young people into STEM fields and innovation. It's a way of upgrading the quality of their supply chains. So if you can fly something that works, aboard Shenzhou, you have to have met a certain level of quality. And it also gives you something to trade with other countries, so it's a form of bargaining. What you don't necessarily see, it's a very centralized view of China. You don't necessarily see a broader narrative of, making the world a better place, or making friends, or having allies, or so forth. It really is about China, very, very sort of centrally. And I think in addition to the problems with the economy and the centralized role of the party, this is actually a real handicap, because people don't like being controlled. They don't like necessarily being put in sort of hierarchical positions. So there's an old saying in Washington, friends come and go and enemies accumulate. It happens in international relations too. And to Dean's earlier point about, of course, the Marxist nature of the party, this shows up oftentimes in some really unusual ways, or unusual maybe for Westerners. For example, in talking about space property rights and talking about resources and so forth, you will see writings of Chinese authors about, beware the new enclosure movement. And people go, what the heck is that? Well, that was like an 18th, 19th century British effort to transform what had been commonly held property in villages and such into privately owned property, and enclosures put around them, which of course impoverished many members of the of rural populations, and of course shifted power and so forth to nobility and more well-to-do people. So this idea of thinking about property in a zero-sum game as something to be controlled, is informed by sort of Marxist analysis of that. And so you hear this kind of comment, and again, then most of the people who weren't forced to study Marx at some point kind of go, what are they talking about? And why do they seem so emotionally excised, at that point? Whereas we talk about property rights as being central to having a growing economy. It's what makes people wealthy. It's the foundation of a growing economy, and not so much.
Just for the audience, think about those hard questions. I'm going to ask a couple difficult ones, but I would like to make sure we get your perspectives as well. Okay, this is maybe the most challenging one of them all. Is the United States taking these space aspirations from the Chinese seriously enough? And in terms of what we are doing, is that sufficient, right, in recognition across the gamut? Yes.
So I like to
That
give
was fast, by the way.
Well, I've had to answer this before. I like to talk about, and I'm not going to do it in the conventional way, I think. I like to talk about the Chang'e 4 Farside lander program. So that was in 2 U.S. National Academy decadal surveys. And in both cases, we chose to fund other programs, right? We did our assessment of our priorities at the time, and we chose not to fund a Farside sample return mission, which the Chinese are now executing. And so now that the Chinese are doing that, the national memory of what our priorities were and why we chose what we chose seems to have diminished. And we're looking at, well, we need to do that too, or they're beating us. And I try to urge people to remember that there was really good reasons why we chose what we chose. And we should be confident in the way we funded our money based on a scientific evaluation of our priorities at that time. And so if we stay true to what do we know are the things that need to be done and will really move the needle, that's where we win, right? This sort of like who gets there first kind of stuff. If that is complementary to what we know needs to be done to move the scientific and innovation needles, great, because that will then give you more funding, right? But if it's not consistent, then I would urge us to really sort of buckle down with what we do really well, which is objective analysis of scientific missions.
I think I couldn't agree with that more. And I think the bumper sticker version of this is I am less worried about what China does, and I'm more worried about what do we fail to do. All right, they're going to do their thing. That's great. I, of course, follow the military developments and so forth. But as far as civil space development and science and all this sort of stuff does, it's up to us. And so it's not a matter of taking them seriously or not. It's a matter, do we take ourselves seriously? The phrase goes, do we have a space program that's worthy of a great nation? And that should be our focus.
Do you have something? Yep.
So it's the early 1960s, and President John F. Kennedy famously says, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and to do these other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
That was brilliant.
And less than 10 years later, with computers where the entire NASA program does not have the computing power on your iPhone, we land, we successfully put a crew on the moon and bring them safely back. Now, I happen to remember when Vice President Pence said, I believe down in Huntsville, that we are going to put an American crew back on the moon by 2024. Keyword, back, right? So we don't have to do all the R&D of can people survive the G-forces on top of Saturn I or Saturn V. We don't have to figure out, gee, what should be the crew capsule's atmosphere, right? We had a tragedy on that one. Well, it's May of 2024. Anybody want to bet me $50 that we're going to make it to the moon this year or next year? So that's the moon. And the one thing that I think all of us up here would agree is that when the Chinese say, as a program, with authoritative documentation, we choose to go to the moon or to Mars, they're going to do it. And if they say we will do it by the end of this decade, or by the 2030 decade, or by the 2040 decade, they will do it. Now, as Scott said, that's not them, right? That's the Chinese decision. What's on us is the Vice President of the United States said, we want to go to the moon. We're going to miss. And what's the American public, and more importantly, American government and American punditry and policymakers' attitude? So, are we in a race? We don't act like it.
Anything to add to this? You're good.
Well said.
I don't think you can. All right, we have time for a couple audience questions. Yeah, come on up. There's a mic right here.
Hi, Elif, a master's student from the Space Policy Institute. Thank you, great discussion. I was just wondering about a scenario in 2050. So let's get to the 2050. So we're somehow succeeding to cooperating with China, I mean, as US. So how could we do it at our best? What are the things that we really tried to really fail fast, but then it turned vice versa, and we actually somehow succeeded in cooperating? Maybe it's an ideal scenario, but I would just ask, like, what would be the ways that we could cooperate if we're thinking about the best scenario about the cooperation in 2050 with China?
Excellent question. I mean, this is why I love these youth perspectives, right? So, ideas on pathways to cooperation with China.
What is it? The global. So there are time frames. I'm forgetting the word. I apologize. But there's basically, everyone comes. International participants come to a meeting where they put out the time frame and they look at everyone's contribution to go to the moon or go to Mars or something like that. And so if we could, an ideal scenario would be to trust each other's systems enough to not double build it and waste that money, but to be like, okay, you're coming with navigation, I'm coming with comms, they're interoperable, I use yours, you use mine, and so we could actually do more because we're planning the resourcing of the systems together.
An answer that I would put, and I don't mean this unkindly or snarkily, but really the Chinese Communist Party has to end. Just as we could not really have the Russians aboard the space station until the Soviet Union ended, there is no way I would see ourselves on Mars with the Chinese if it's still ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. Because, bluntly, I don't want to see gulags or prison camps or whatever beyond the Earth. And we had this argument in the 1980s when there was discussions about going to Mars with the Soviets. And I had actually the same position really back then, that the politics and human values matter. It's not a technical question. Now, are there things where we could coordinate better? Absolutely. There are ways to provide cross-support to Chinese missions using CCSDS standards that are well-known open protocols. We could learn from biomedical data that they have. But the degree of trust that would be required for human missions together would require a change in the political structure. So if China is not ruled by the Communist Party in 2049, God willing, then we could be talking about a new era for cooperation that would be symbolized by going to Mars together with the Chinese. But if not, then I think no.
So I know there's a really long line, but they're going to kick us off the stage. So I would definitely invite you to come meet us afterwards, and we're happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Dean, Kevin, Kristin, Dr. Pace. This has been a really meaty conversation. We probably could have a whole conference just on this, so thank you.